When you look at Apple's core business, it's doing very well, even though the top line is not growing in double digits like it used to a few years ago. But even with 5 to 7% growth, tight cost control, this company is generating enough free cash. I think the biggest thing what we are trying to point out is when you look at the other large tech companies, somebody like a Microsoft or an AWS, they are going to spend billions of dollars over the next few years in order to expand their cloud data centers, invest in AI. But in the case of Apple, I think they are the ones that are going to stand out over the next 12 to 24 months because they are not doing that same level of spending because they don't have that kind of business. Now, the Google case you brought up is an important point, and that's a big risk for Apple. But we're still far away to figure out what the remedies are going to be. As long as there is no binding, if Google and Apple can renegotiate and figure out if people get choices, I think there is chances that they can, salvage some of that particular $20 billion revenue that comes in. Now, if they are able to, if the judge comes out and says, well, you cannot pay them anything, then that's a problem. But even in that case, I think it'll be a few years before Apple can make up for that revenue loss.
I want to go back to this idea of Apple not having to make those huge CapEx investments in AI like Microsoft and Amazon have to do when it comes to infrastructure and actually building out these facilities on Anurag. Is it a risk for Apple that they're partnering instead with other companies that are making these investments and not doing them themselves? Is there a chance that they could run into an issue with a platform taking off that's not their own platform?
Yeah, see, they're in the device business, in all honesty. When you look at the iPhone, they're really not into cloud computing or giving people infrastructure to build their applications. So that's a completely different equation in my view. It's like, getting electricity. You really don't need to own your own generators in order to get electricity. So when you look at Apple, they're basically saying, in the same case what they have with Google, they don't want to be in that search business. They're going to go try to get a partnership with anybody who has the best search business right now, and they will put that on their phones. They did that with OpenAI. They went out and talked to a bunch of people and says, who has the best large language model that would work well on their iPhone? And they chose OpenAI to be one of their partners. So that's part of their business model, and that's part of the reasons why they don't need to spend that much in CapEx.
It's interesting. We talked with David Weston, who is a lawyer and spent a lot of time doing antitrust work specifically. And I do wonder about some of these big technology companies, Anurag, that they are successful at what they do, and is that a crime that just because you're good at what you do? And I was actually having a conversation with one of my sisters this week, and we were talking about Google, and I'm like, but do you try any other kind of search engine? She's like, nope, because Google just works so well. So when is it a crime that you are really good at what you do and you just become big because of that? How do we figure out when it is an antitrust issue and when it's not?
Yeah, I think, all these companies are generating billions and billions of dollars of free cash flow, which really will attract a lot of lawyers, as you can imagine. Now, let's say in the case of iPhone, if tomorrow, when I turn on my iOS or I install a brand new operating system, it'll ask me, which search engine do you want to use? It's going to give me 6 choices. Most likely or not, I'm going to pick Google. And that is going to help Google. I think the bigger question in this whole equation is, what happens to that payment that's happening?
Well, that's why, I think sort of counterintuitively, couldn't this actually be a great thing for Google if people end up using Google and choosing Google because they're not choosing a competitor, but then Google doesn't have to make these payments to Apple? That's just like icing on the cake. This could be a big win for Alphabet, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I'm saying, that in this entire case, it's Apple who's going to lose. But here's my counter argument. Here's my counter argument to that. Apple's a company with, as I said, over $100 billion in free cash flow. If they really wanted to fight Google in search, they can do it. They can go and acquire a small vendor and use that in their pipeline. Remember, they control distribution of 2.2 billion devices. Google's going to lose a lot of market share if it doesn't play nice with Apple. So, I get it that in the short term, they will be, you could say, benefit from it. But I don't think they would want to pick a fight with Apple on this one.
Interesting. The antitrust case, though, against Apple by the Department of Justice, they say to classify Apple as a monopolist, the government attorneys carved out its relevant product market as only including premium smartphones, a segment apparently distinct from entry-level and less expensive gadgets. I mean, it's kind of like you're dicing and slicing the market here, right? right?
Yeah. So when you look at Apple's entire, so there are roughly about 5+ billion smartphones in the world, and Apple's market share is roughly about 20% or 1 billion. But yeah, you could make the argument if it was only the expensive category, they have over 50% of the market share. But there are only two players out there. Either it's Samsung or it's Apple. There isn't really a big third player in the premium market that anybody wants to deal with. But we think 20% of the market share in the global smartphone market, that really is the big case for Apple, which is as people become more affluent, they will go out and get Apple because it's an aspirational brand for people in emerging markets. It's really the place you want to be. But in most cases, you don't even qualify to buy that product because it's so expensive.
Well, and the thing about, Apple with these large language models and all of the AI that's being, done, I guess, do they not care? Go ahead and everybody else, you spend money, you develop it, and then we'll give you the device that people can play with it on. Is that what it's all about?
Yeah, but if I was to take the other argument of it is, if they started doing everything else, then people will say, well, they're using the distribution to unfairly, push their own product.
Right.
They're basically saying, if you build the best product out there, we will use it, and we will use it on the merit of the product. In this particular case, they didn't go out and pick, Google's Gemini on round one. Mm-hmm. I think there's down the road, I think it may happen, but they chose OpenAI because they have, at this point, the best large language model out there.
Okay, speaking of the Apple being a device company, it's the iPhone company, no question. The iPhone 16, likely we'll see it unveiled in just a few weeks.
I was getting ready and thinking really hard, so was Paul Sweeney, about replacing my phone come later this year, and now I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't. Well,
that's the big question, because Mark Gurman out with his Power On newsletter over the weekend, Anurag, talking about how this is perhaps one of those stopgap models that gives people a bridge to the next one, perhaps doesn't get people to do an upgrade super cycle. How are you thinking about it at Bloomberg Intelligence?
Yeah, in a similar vein, we don't think it's going to have a massive layout in year one. Over a 3-year period, I think it's going to help. But at this point, we don't have, we are looking at maybe a 5% bump in total unit shipments sold next year, FY25 over FY24. And that's because the last 2 years has been kind of weak. The Apple's install base moves at a certain rate. And you refresh your phone to be honest, when the battery runs out. That number used to be 3.6 years for a few years, but it's been extended closer to 4 years at this point. So at an average, globally, out of that 1 billion phones I talked about, people refresh it every 4 years. So I think that is what we're going to see. We're not going to see a massive bump because of AI.
All right, just to wrap up here, as you know, we're over the hump, if you will, in terms of half of 2024 already over. How are you thinking about the rest of the year when it comes to technology in terms of some of the big major themes, whether it's AI, CapEx spending? Are we going to see more kind of worrisome notes or worrisome updates, or do you feel pretty confident about the rest of the year?
See, I think from a fundamental point of view, this is going to be fine. I mean, I don't see any reason why the big tech companies, whether it's Microsoft or whether it's Amazon Web Services, their core business is strong and it will remain. The stock reaction is a very different game because that depends on interest rates and so many other factors. And that's really, we'll see what happens with that. But at the same time, they will spend a lot of money in order to beef up their capacity so that they can grow over the next 3 to 5 years. I think that is really, in our view, a good long-term play, but in the short term, it may have its ups and downs.